Shut up and sit down.
On this episode, we're going to explore more science fantasy. First, a quick thank you to the views and comments on my first video about science fantasy. It's because of you that I decided to do a follow-up, and I've based this video around user comments. With expansive world building, intricate politics, complex characters, and an epic story, Frank Herbert's original novel Dune has captured the attention of readers for over half a century and even spawned 2 feature film versions. It has long been categorized as science fiction or even space opera. So then why does it make the list of science fantasy? Because while it might use a lot of the tropes and ideas found in science fiction, such as interstellar travel, automaton assassins, or distant planets, Dune can also be considered an epic fantasy novel. From its opening pages, it isn't hard to draw immediate parallels with the fantasy genre, as traditional fantasy tropes are evident in the plot. Paul is a young chosen one, forced to go learn techniques from a mysterious mystical tribe to exact vengeance on behalf of his slain family. The story unfolds with descriptions of strange religious trials, ancestral feuds, an evil baron, psionic wizardry, and a triumphant scene of riding a giant sandworm. The final moments see the deposing of the corrupt emperor and the crowning of a hero. Dune successfully merges mystical elements with more technical elements to balance and reinforce each other. It allowed Herbert to keep the border between the genres fluid and makes the world of Dune so distinctive. It seamlessly settles its more traditional epic fantasy story into a grand space opera. This is what makes Dune an enduring novel. What is more fantasy than swords, great castles, a source of magic that the evildoers want for themselves, and a chosen one who must fight them back? He-Man at its core could be a pure fantasy story. However, what the creators of the toy line and subsequent animated series opted to do was mix in technological elements as well. So, while you have He-Man wielding the Sword of Power, and Evelyn or the Sorceress using magic, you also have Man-at-Arms with blaster guns, or Trapjaw, who is basically made up of mechanical parts. The 1987 film version of He-Man went one step further and based the entire premise in present day. They also upped the tech with even more blaster guns while keeping the magic intact. On the flip side, the Netflix adaptation from Kevin Smith seemed to lean into more of the fantasy than the sci-fi. But, no matter what variation He-Man takes on, it will always include elements of fantasy and science fiction to drive the story. Thundercats. This 80s gem often gets overlooked by those that didn't grow up watching it, but Thundercats held every aspect of what the science fantasy genre is all about. The Thundercats themselves are fantasy creatures whom are part human, part jungle cat. Long before shifters ruled paranormal romance, the Thundercats ruled Third Earth. Their villainous counterparts are also creatures of fantasy, particularly the baddest villain of them all, Mum-Ra. An ancient magical mummy who has seemingly endless powers and eternal life gave the heroes their toughest battles. But in the midst of the fantasy elements, there are also bits of science fiction that weave their way in. The Thunder Tank and other weapons or aircraft are built by Panthro from scrap metal, off the ship they crash-landed on Third Earth with. Speaking of Third Earth, it is an imaginative spin of Earth itself, where both fantasy creatures and technological beings roam. One minute you can go from the ghost of Jaga or Groon to a speedered bike chase with Space Cop Mandora, or Safari Joe hunting the Thundercats with a laser cannon. If ever there were a TV show that epitomizes what science fantasy is all about, it would be Thundercats. Final Fantasy is a Japanese science fantasy anthology created by Square Enix. The franchise centers on a series of fantasy and science fantasy role-playing video games. The premise usually finds you in the war-ravaged shoes of a hero or cast of heroes who has to fight against all odds to defeat some sort of powerful enemy. There are usually large, sprawling worlds packed with interesting settings and amazing music. As Final Fantasy started with sci-fi tech elements and in otherwise fantasy settings in their initial installments, they eventually embraced and expanded on the idea of future settings for their games. The inclusion of sci-fi elements is probably due to the fantasy trope of lost civilizations creating high tech. Many debate that this influence has come from Dungeons & Dragons, which always included a smattering of science fiction in their enemies and possibly existing on its fringes. For whatever the reason, the blending of science and fantasy has made the Final Fantasy series one of the most popular video games to date. Xenoblade Chronicles is a series of action role-playing games developed by Monolith Soft and published by Nintendo. Once again, all over the online forums, you'll see the debate rage on whether Xenoblade is more fantasy or sci-fi. It seems as though the science fantasy genre still remains a well-guarded secret. However, while some still debate whether Xenoblade Chronicles is science fiction or fantasy, others realize that it combines both elements of fantasy and science fiction in an epic clash. As one article states, the open-world adventure puts players on the front lines of the ultimate battle between man and machine. Today's versions of the Xenoblade Chronicles for Nintendo lets players jump into an epic story that merges the best elements of fantasy and science fiction. Players control Shulk as they engage monsters in battle and go on quests. So right there you have a machine race with more fantasy elements combining as one. Did I miss any? Let me know in the comments below, and perhaps there will be a third version of exploring science fantasy.